A label is a powerful thing, and when you pin one on a child, you aren't just describing their behavior, you are defining their future before they even get a chance to live it. I have sat across from thousands of people in my career, and if there is one thing I have learned, it is that crazy is a word used by people who have run out of answers. It's a convenient bucket to throw a human being into when you don't want to do the heavy lifting of understanding the why behind the what. When I first heard about this 16-year-old girl, Maya, the file on my desk was thick with psychiatric evaluations, school disciplinary reports, and frantic emails from her parents. They didn't just say she was difficult, they said she was broken. They said she was a danger to herself and everyone around her, but as I sat backstage watching her on the monitors before walking out, I didn't see a monster. I saw a young girl who was drowning in a glass of water, and her family was standing on the shore complaining about the splash. I walked onto that stage and felt the familiar hum of the studio lights, but more than that, I felt the tension radiating from the three people sitting on my stage. On the left were Linda and David, the parents. They were polished, well-dressed, and looked like the picture of suburban stability, except for the exhaustion etched into their faces. On the right sat Maya. She had her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was trying to hold her own bones together. She had that defensive I don't care mask on that every teenager uses when they are actually terrified. She was wearing heavy eyeliner, her hair was a mess, and she wouldn't look at me. Her parents had spent the last 20 minutes before I walked out telling my producers that they were terrified of their own daughter. They used words like bipolar, schizophrenic, and sociopath. They weren't doctors, but they were weaponizing medical terminology to explain why their home had turned into a war zone. My job in these first few minutes isn't to judge, it's to observe the currency of the exchange. In every family, there is a currency. It might be guilt, it might be fear, or it might be silence. In this family, the currency was blame. Linda started talking the second I sat down, her voice trembling with a practiced kind of martyrdom. She told me Maya had tried to jump out of a moving car. She told me Maya had destroyed her bedroom in a fit of rage because she couldn't go to a party. She looked at me with tears welling up and said, "Dr. Phil, we've tried everything. We've had her hospitalized, we've put her on every medication, and she just gets worse. Everyone thinks she's crazy, and honestly, we're starting to believe it too." I looked over at Maya. She didn't flinch. She just stared at a spot on the floor, her jaw set. That's a red flag for me. When a child hears their mother call them crazy on national television and doesn't even blink, it means they've heard it so often it's become their skin. It wasn't an insult to her anymore. It was an identity. I turned to Maya, and I didn't use the doctor voice. I used the man-to-man voice, the one that asks for the truth without the sugarcoating. I asked her, "Maya, your mom says you're crazy. Your dad says he's scared of you. What do you say?" She finally looked up, and her eyes weren't empty, they were burning. She told me, "I'm not crazy. I'm just the only one in this house who isn't a liar." That's a powerful statement from a 16-year-old. It shifted the energy in the room instantly. Linda tried to interrupt, to correct the record, but I held up a hand. I wanted to hear Maya's truth, even if it was distorted, because the truth in a toxic family is rarely a set of facts. It's a feeling. Maya explained that every time she tried to express a shred of emotion, sadness, anger, frustration, it was immediately labeled as a symptom. If she cried, she was unstable. If she got angry, she was manic. She was living in a world where her parents were the judges, the jury, and the wardens, and she was the only inmate. As we started to peel back the layers, I began to see the who I am of this situation. Maya wasn't just a rebellious teen. She was the identified patient. In family systems theory, the identified patient is the one person who manifests the symptoms of a much larger, hidden family sickness. It's like a pressure valve on a steam engine. If the pressure in the house gets too high, the valve pops so the whole thing doesn't explode. Maya was the pop. She was acting out so her parents didn't have to look at their own crumbling marriage or their own individual failures. David the father sat there like a statue. He was the silent enabler. He let Linda do all the talking, all the disciplining, and all the blaming. He thought he was being the peacekeeper, but in reality, he was a ghost in his own home. I told him right then and there, David, you're not a bystander in this. Your silence is a choice, and it's a choice that's costing your daughter her sanity. I've seen this pattern 1,000 times. A child starts to struggle, maybe it's a little anxiety or a bad grade, and instead of the parents looking at the environment, they look at the child as if they are a defective product. They start taking the kid to experts to get them fixed. But you can't fix a fish if the water in the tank is toxic. Maya was swimming in toxic water. Every time she went to a therapist, Linda would pull the therapist aside afterward to tell them what Maya really meant, or to list all the bad things Maya had done that week. They weren't seeking healing. They were seeking validation for their narrative that Maya was the problem. Maya felt that. She felt the weight of their expectations and the sting of their disappointment every single day. When a child feels like they can never be good enough, they often decide to be the best bad person they can be. It's a way of taking control. It's like saying, if you're going to call me crazy, I'll show you what crazy really looks like. That brings us to the central problem, the loss of the authentic self. Maya didn't know who she was outside of being the crazy daughter. She had been stripped of her agency. She told me about a time she tried to bake a cake for her mother's birthday, and because she accidentally left the oven on for 10 minutes too long, Linda accused her of trying to burn the house down on purpose. That is a psychological vacuum. There is no air left to breathe in a house like that. I looked at the parents and I didn't hold back. I told them, you've created a monster and now you're complaining that it bites. You could hear a pin drop in that studio. Linda's face went pale and David finally looked up from his shoes. They wanted me to tell them which boarding school to send her to or which pill would make her quiet. They didn't want me to tell them that the problem was staring back at them in the mirror. But we were just getting started. To understand how we got to this point, we had to go back. We had to look at the history, the patterns, and the subtle ways this family had been breaking apart for years. This wasn't something that happened overnight. This was a slow-motion car crash that had been years in the making, and the wreckage was strewn all over that stage. I needed to know about the early years, the first signs of the rift, and the moment when the crazy label first became the family's primary language. Because until we acknowledged the history, we were just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. I leaned in, looked Maya in the eye, and asked her to tell me about the first time she felt like she didn't belong in her own family. That's when the real story began to emerge, the one that wasn't in any of the doctor's files. The backstory of this family wasn't written in medical journals. It was written in the quiet corners of a home where appearance mattered more than substance. As Maya began to talk, the picture of the perfect child started to crumble, and what emerged was far more tragic. She described a childhood where she was the crown jewel of her mother's social standing. Linda didn't just want a daughter, she wanted a trophy. Maya was enrolled in every extracurricular activity imaginable: ballet, violin, competitive gymnastics, advanced placement prep in middle school. On the outside, they looked like the American dream, but on the inside, Maya was being crushed by the weight of a standard she could never fully meet. She told me about the performance reviews. That's what she called the Sunday night dinners, where Linda would sit her down and go over her week, pointing out every flaw, every missed opportunity, and every perceived slight. I looked at Linda as Maya described this, and I saw her nodding slightly, not out of empathy, but as if she were proud of her high standards. I had to stop her right there. I said, Linda, do you realize you were treating your daughter like a corporate branch manager instead of a child? You were auditing her life before she even knew who she was. Linda tried to defend herself, saying she only wanted Maya to have the best opportunities, but that's the classic mask of the controlling parent. It's all for your own good until the child stops performing. The shift happened when Maya was 13. The pressure finally blew a fuse. She didn't have a psychotic break, she had a human break. She missed a gymnastics meet because she was exhausted, and when she got home, the audit was so brutal that she locked herself in the bathroom and refused to come out. Instead of asking, "Are you okay?" Linda called a psychiatrist. That was the moment the crazy narrative began. Because Linda couldn't accept that her parenting or her pressure was the cause, she had to find a biological defect in Maya. If Maya was sick, then Linda wasn't a bad mother. She was a warrior mom fighting for her troubled child. It's a subtle but devastating shift in the family dynamic. Suddenly, Maya wasn't a girl who was tired and stressed. She was a patient with a chemical imbalance. They put her on anti-anxiety meds, then mood stabilizers when she reacted poorly to the first set. By the time she was 14, she was a walking pharmacy, and her personality was buried under a layer of chemical fog. David, meanwhile, checked out completely. He told me he just wanted to keep the peace. I told him peace at any price is no peace at all. You traded your daughter's soul for a quiet house, and that is a bargain you're going to regret for the rest of your life. He looked like I'd slapped him, but sometimes you have to cauterize a wound to start the healing. He had been the one person Maya might have turned to, but every time she tried, he would tell her to just listen to your mother or don't make a scene. He wasn't a peacekeeper, he was a coward. He was terrified of Linda's intensity, so he used Maya as a human shield. As long as Linda was focused on fixing Maya, she wasn't focusing on the fact that David had been emotionally checked out of their marriage for a decade. As the years went by, the behavior escalated because the frustration had nowhere to go. Maya started to realize that the only way to get her parents to actually see her, not the trophy, but the person, was to be loud, be angry, and be crazy. It was a cry for help that they chose to interpret as a symptom of a disease. She started hanging out with a bad crowd, which, in her case, just meant kids who didn't care about their GPA. She dyed her hair, she got piercings, and she started talking back. To a mother like Linda, this wasn't just rebellion, it was an existential threat. The escalation was like a runaway train. The more Linda pushed for control, the more Maya exploded. The more Maya exploded, the more Linda sought out more experts and more diagnoses. We talked about the moving car incident that Linda had mentioned earlier. Maya's version was very different. They were on the way to a mandatory therapy session, the third one that week. Maya was crying, telling her mother she couldn't breathe, that she felt like she was suffocating. Linda's response was to tell her that her mania was showing and that they might need to discuss inpatient treatment. Maya told me, "I didn't want to die. I just wanted to get away from her voice." I felt like if I stayed in that car one more second, my brain was going to melt. She opened the door while the car was slowing down for a stoplight and ran. She didn't jump out at 60 miles an hour. She escaped. But in Linda's retelling, it was a suicidal gesture. This is the danger of the crazy label. Once it's applied, every single action is filtered through that lens. If you're labeled crazy and you're happy, you're manic. If you're sad, you're depressed. If you're angry, you're hostile. There is no winning. You lose the right to have a normal range of human emotions. Maya was living in a psychological prison where the walls were made of her parents' expectations and the bars were made of her own medical records. She had become a professional patient. She knew all the terminology, she knew how to play the game, and she had lost her sense of self in the process. I asked her, "Maya, when was the last time you felt like just a normal 16-year-old girl?" She looked at me, and for the first time, her tough girl mask cracked. Her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "I don't think I ever have. I think I was born a problem." That broke my heart, and it should have broken her parents' hearts too. But Linda was already preparing her rebuttal. She was looking for the flaw in Maya's story, the proof that she was being manipulative. That's when I knew we weren't just dealing with a rebellious teen. We were dealing with a family system that was addicted to its own dysfunction. I had to explain to them that they were in a closed-loop system. Linda provides the pressure, Maya provides the explosion, David provides the silence, and then they all go to a doctor to get a pill to start the cycle all over again. Nobody was taking responsibility. It was always someone else's fault. Maya blamed her parents, Linda blamed Maya's illness, and David blamed the stress. I told them, we are going to stop the blame game right now because the blame is a dead end. We need to talk about the truth. And the truth is that none of you are happy and all of you are responsible. I wanted to dive deeper into the escalation phase because that's where the fireworks really started. The tension in the house had reached a boiling point where the smallest things, a missed phone call, a dirty dish, a certain tone of voice would trigger a 3-day war. Maya described how she felt like she was constantly being watched, like there were cameras in her brain. Linda admitted to reading Maya's diary, tracking her phone, and even calling the parents of her friends to warn them about Maya's condition. It wasn't parenting, it was surveillance. And when you treat a child like a criminal, don't be surprised when they start acting like one. The stage was set for a confrontation that had been years in the making. And it wasn't just going to happen in my studio, it was happening in their souls. The escalation didn't just happen in the house, it leaked into every facet of their lives until there was no safe harbor left for Maya. By the time they reached out to our show, the situation had gone nuclear. The incidents were no longer just about backtalk or messy rooms. They were about police being called to the house because a door was slammed too hard or because Maya had screamed, "I hate you," so loud the neighbors thought someone was being murdered. Linda described these moments with a chilling clinical detachment, as if she were reading a police blotter. She told me about the night she decided Maya needed to be removed for the safety of the family. Maya had been cornered in her room, Linda standing in the doorway, refusing to let her leave until she admitted she was having a manic episode. Maya, feeling caged and desperate, had pushed past her mother to get to the hallway. Linda fell or claimed she was pushed, and that was it. She didn't call a counselor, she didn't call David, she called 911. I looked at David as this story was told, and I asked him where he was that night. He said he was in the garage working on his car. He heard the screaming, he heard the sirens, and he stayed in the garage. That is the definition of a broken family system. You have one person acting as the aggressor, one acting as the victim, and one acting like they're on another planet. I told David, you didn't stay in the garage because you didn't know what was happening. You stayed in the garage because you were letting the two women you love most in the world tear each other apart so you wouldn't have to get your hands dirty. It's a harsh thing to say, but I've learned that you can't heal a family until you stop the bleeding, and David's passivity was the sharpest knife in the room. His daughter was being carted off in a police car, and he was checking the oil in his SUV. The escalation reached its peak when Maya was placed in a short-term psychiatric facility. For Linda, this was a victory. It was the ultimate "I told you so." It was the proof she needed to show the world that she wasn't the problem, her daughter was clinically broken. But for Maya, that was the day she stopped trying. When you're 16 and you're locked in a ward with people who are actually struggling with severe chronic psychosis, and you're only there because you had an argument with your mother, something inside you dies. She told me about the quiet room and the way the nurses looked at her with that blank, pitying stare. She realized then that as long as she was in that house, she would never be seen as a person again. She was just a case. When they finally got her out, the home wasn't a place of reconciliation, it was a place of surveillance. Linda had installed cameras. She had a breathalyzer for when Maya came home from school, even though Maya didn't drink. It was about the possibility of bad behavior. It was a preemptive strike against Maya's autonomy. This is what I call catastrophic parenting. You're so afraid of what might happen that you ensure it does happen by creating an environment of total distrust. I asked Linda, if I followed you around all day with a camera, recorded every word you said, and had a doctor analyze your every mood swing, how long do you think you'd last before you started acting crazy? She didn't have an answer. She just kept clinging to her list of Maya's symptoms. This led us directly into the heart of the confrontation on my stage. I had to pivot from the what to the so what. I looked at the medical reports the parents had provided. I had my own team look at them. And what we found was a pattern of diagnostic shopping. They had seen 5 different doctors. When one doctor said Maya was just a stressed teenager who needed family therapy, Linda would find a new doctor. She kept going until she found one who would give her the labels she wanted. I held those papers up and I told Linda, you didn't want a cure, you wanted a label, because a label is a shield that protects you from having to look at your own behavior. The confrontation moved to a deeper level when I addressed the truth. Maya was so desperate to tell. I asked her to forget about the labels, forget about the hospital, and tell me what she wanted more than anything else in the world. She didn't say she wanted a car or clothes or to be famous. She looked at her father, not her mother, her father, and she said, I just want you to tell her to stop. I just want you to tell her that I'm your daughter and that you love me even when I'm not perfect. That was the breakthrough. The room went silent. The crazy girl wasn't asking for medication or a different hospital. She was asking for a father. I turned back to David. I told him, the weight of this entire family is on your shoulders right now. You have allowed your wife to pathologize your daughter because it was easier than dealing with your wife's anxiety. You have sacrificed Maya on the altar of your own comfort. David finally started to break. He started to cry, not the quiet, polite cry he'd been doing, but a real gut-wrenching sob. He admitted that he knew Linda was being too hard, that he knew the cameras were too much, but he was tired of the fighting. I told him, you're tired? Imagine how she feels. She's 16. She's supposed to be looking forward to her life, and instead, she's looking over her shoulder to see if her mom is recording her. The confrontation then shifted to Linda. She was still being defensive, still trying to bring up an incident from 2 years ago to justify her current behavior. I had to be very firm with her. I said, Linda, you are addicted to being the victim of your daughter. You have built a whole identity around being the long-suffering mother of a troubled teen. If Maya gets well, if she becomes a happy, healthy, independent young woman, who are you then? You'd just be a woman with a distant husband and a lot of empty time. You need her to be sick so you can stay busy. It was a surgical strike. It went straight to the core of the enmeshment. Maya was watching her mother's face, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. Not because she was glad her mother was being scolded, but because someone was finally seeing the reality she had been living in. I told them that we were going to strip away all the labels. We were going to stop talking about bipolar and sociopathy and mania. We were going to talk about a mother who was scared of losing control and a daughter who was desperate to find it. I told Linda that if she didn't stop this psychological warfare, she was going to lose her daughter forever. And it wouldn't be because of a mental illness. It would be because she drove her away. I asked Maya if she was willing to work on her part of this, because even though she was the identified patient, she had developed some very toxic coping mechanisms. She was manipulative in her own way, using her outbursts to punish her parents. I told her, you can't claim you're not crazy and then act like a madwoman every time you don't get your way. If you want to be treated like an adult, you have to start acting like one, even when the people around you aren't. We had to move past the blame and toward the what now. The tension was still high, but the air had changed. The truth was out there now. It wasn't a medical truth, it was a relational truth. We had spent so much time talking about Maya's brain that we had forgotten to talk about her heart. I told the parents that they had a choice. They could leave this stage and continue down the path of doctors and drugs and eventual estrangement, or they could commit to a radical change in how they functioned as a family. But that meant the cameras had to go. The performance reviews had to stop, and David had to step out of the garage and into his life. The air in the studio after a confrontation like that is heavy. You can almost feel the molecules vibrating with the weight of things finally said out loud. When we went to a break, I didn't just walk off into the wings. I stayed there for a moment watching them. The cameras were still rolling for the after-show footage, but the performance was over. Linda was slumped in her chair, looking smaller than she had all day. David was actually touching Maya's hand, not a heavy, controlling grip, but a tentative, questioning reach. That's where the real work begins. People think the breakthrough on the stage is the end of the story, but in reality, it's just the first crack in a very thick wall. I told them we were moving to a private room to talk about the next steps, because you don't just open a wound like that and then send people out into the parking lot to drive home together. In the green room, away from the audience, the tone shifted. It was no longer about who was right. It was about whether they wanted to survive as a family. I sat down with them and laid out the unplugging process. I told Linda that the cameras in the house had to be gone by the time they landed back home. I told David that he was going to be the one to take them down. This was a symbolic and literal reclaiming of his role as a protector of his daughter's privacy, not just a passive observer of her misery. Linda started to protest, mentioning a safety concern, and I had to stop her. I told her, Linda, your safety concerns are a smokescreen for your anxiety. If you can't trust your daughter to be in her own room without a lens on her, then you've already lost her. You are choosing a sense of false security over a real relationship. We talked for hours about the outcome we were looking for. I didn't promise them that Maya would suddenly become a straight-A student who never raised her voice. That's not reality. What I promised was that we could get back to a place where a bad day was just a bad day, not a reason for a clinical intervention. We arranged for Maya to go to a specialized residential program, not a locked psychiatric ward, but a place that focused on emotional intelligence and transitional living. It was a place where she could learn who she was without the labels and where her parents couldn't interfere with her progress. Simultaneously, Linda and David had to enter their own intensive therapy to deal with their marriage and Linda's need for pathological control. 6 months later, I followed up with them. The transformation wasn't perfect, but it was profound. Maya had spent 4 months in the program, and for the first time in years, she was off the heavy-duty cocktails of medications that had been clouding her mind. It turns out, when you remove the constant surveillance and the crazy narrative, the symptoms tend to dry up. She was still a teenager, she was still moody, she still had a sharp tongue, but she was no longer explosive. She had learned that she didn't need to burn the house down just to be heard. She told me in our follow-up call that the biggest change was being able to wake up in the morning and not feel like she was under a microscope. She started drawing again, something she'd given up years ago because her mother had critiqued her art as being too dark and a sign of depression. David had finally stepped up. He told me that taking those cameras down was the hardest and best thing he'd ever done. It led to a massive blowout with Linda, but for the first time, he didn't retreat to the garage. He stayed in the room. He told her that he loved her, but that he wouldn't let her destroy their daughter anymore. That's the outcome that matters, the shifting of the power dynamic. Linda, to her credit, stayed in therapy. She had to confront the fact that her own mother had been a controlling perfectionist, and she had simply been passing the torch. She had to learn to find value in herself that didn't involve managing Maya. It was a slow, painful process of letting go. And there were plenty of relapses where she'd try to check Maya's phone or question her tone, but now David was there to check her, and Maya was equipped with the tools to respond instead of reacting. The truth is, crazy is often just a word for a soul that has been pushed into a corner with no way out. Maya wasn't broken, the system around her was. When we talk about the truth on Doctor, Phil, it's not about some big gotcha moment. It's about the quiet, uncomfortable realization that we are all the architects of our own misery, and we are also the only ones who can tear it down. Maya is 16 now, almost 17. She's looking at colleges. She's thinking about a future that doesn't involve a hospital bed or a therapist's couch. She still has scars, psychological ones that might take years to fully fade, but she is no longer a patient. She's a young woman. I think back to that first moment on stage. Seeing that girl with the crossed arms and the burning eyes, she was so ready for a fight because she thought the whole world was her enemy. She thought crazy was her name. If there is one thing I want people to take away from her story, it's that we have to be very careful with the words we use to describe the people we love. Words have a way of becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. If you tell a child they are a problem long enough, they will eventually solve that problem by becoming exactly what you fear. But if you have the courage to look past the behavior and see the person, if you have the strength to stop blaming and start listening, you can find your way back from the edge. This family was on the brink of a permanent fracture. If they hadn't come to that stage, Maya would have likely been institutionalized again, or she would have run away the second she turned 18, never to look back. Linda would have spent the rest of her life wondering where she failed, and David would have died in that garage, surrounded by tools and silence. Instead, they chose the hard road of honesty. They chose to stop the performance reviews and start having conversations. They chose to see that crazy was just a cry for a connection that had been lost a long time ago. As I reflect on this case, it reminds me why I do what I do. It's not for the drama or the ratings, it's for that moment when the mask falls off and a human being finally feels seen for who they actually are, not who they've been told to be. Maya isn't crazy. She never was. She was just a girl who wanted her father to stand up for her and her mother to love her without conditions. And once she got that, the madness simply didn't have a reason to exist anymore. It's a simple truth, but it's one that a lot of people spend their whole lives running from. In the end, the truth didn't just set Maya free, it gave her back her life. And that is the only outcome that ever truly counts. I see it so often, this desperate need to pathologize human suffering. We want to believe there's a biological glitch, because if it's a glitch, we can blame nature. If it's a relationship, we have to blame ourselves. And that's the hardest pill of all to swallow. But once you swallow it, the healing can actually begin. Maya, Linda, and David are a work in progress, just like all of us. There are no happily ever afters in my line of work, only healthier ever afters. And for a girl who was once written off as a sociopath by her own parents, healthier is a damn good place to be.